Hola, buenos dias, good morning. Everybody had a good time at the drinks event last evening, yesterday? I see some of us had a better time than others, but the ones that are not here. Anyway, hopefully you'll enjoy this talk. I'm going to do a brief Grails 3.1 roadmap update, and we can open it up for questions and so on. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Graeme Rocher. I'm the project lead of Grails. I've been doing this for a long time. So if you see those recruiters that are asking for 10 years of Grails experience, that's probably only me. But I represent OCI. If we're a full services organization, and if you are looking for help with your Grails applications, whether it's doing the big Grails 3 upgrade or seeking some short-term consulting or training or anything, get in touch. With those contact either via Twitter, email, there's a variety of forms you can get in contact with us. Just in terms of where we are with Grails 3, in terms of a status update, the Grails 3.1.4 is the current stable release of Grails, and 3.0.x and 2.x are now in maintenance mode. 3.0.x, we continue to release small point releases for it, and also for 2.5.x. So recently we did 3.0.15, and we did 2.5.5, I think it was, or 4. Grails 2 plugins are continuing to be migrated. So the plugin repository for Grails 3 is now up to, I think, about 140 plugins or so. Most of the important ones that you need to be productive are already available. And thanks to the kind folks over at Agile Orbit, they contributed a new plugin portal for Grails 3. So now when you go to the plugin section of the Grails website, it's Grails 3 plugins, and there's a link on the left if you want to go to the older portal, so the information is more up to date. We are still catching up with a lot of documentation and plugin information and all of that stuff, bringing it up to date with Grails 3, but that's all in progress and progressing well. And the new portal is a big help for discoverability of Grails plugins and getting folks productive with Grails 3. The other thing is we have a community channel on Slack. So if you want to get in touch with us, that's a great way nowadays. I think we're up to nearly 1,800 people, roughly. I don't know. I haven't checked the last count. But about 1,800 people on Slack now, talking about Grails and getting their problems solved and participating in the community. So it's a great way to engage. So I recommend you check that out. So just to recap, and out of interest, out of a show of hands, how many people are using Grails 3? How many people are using Grails 2? Way! So we are hoping to convince a lot of you folks using Grails 2 to move to Grails 3. And as a recap, for if you have not been following progress, Grails 3 has that same familiarity and experience that you get in Grails 2. So when you start using it, it'll be instantly familiar. However, it is a fundamental rewrite of the framework on top of a new architecture that's based on Spring Boot, Gradle, and the notion of profiles, which I'll discuss shortly. It's evolved from a fundamentally metaprogramming-based dynamic framework in Grails 2 to a fundamentally AST compilation-driven framework in Grails 3. So it looks and feels very much the same, but it's very different. But it's all in good ways. So we recommend that you check it out, and I'll hopefully during the presentation you'll see some of that. So I'm sure most of you are probably already familiar with Gradle. By a show of hands, who uses Gradle? Quite a few hands there. So, but for those of you who are not, it's a much more powerful build system. In Grails 2, we had really a custom set of scripts. Grails 2 was created. The Grails 2 build system was created at a time when the only options were Ant and Maven, both of which sent shivers down my spine. We created Grails 2 and the build system that it was based on something called Gantt, which was a wraparound Ant builder, and Gradle didn't exist. If it had existed, Grails would have been built on Gradle from the beginning, and it's a fantastically powerful build tool with both the power of declarative dependency resolution and dependency management, but also the flexibility to create plugins, write build logic in Groovy when necessary, adapt to a wide range of scenarios. So you'll find that many plugins in Grails 2 won't be migrated to Grails 3 just because they don't make sense anymore. So a lot of Grails plugins, for example, will build-related plugins. So if you use Grails 2, you might remember the code coverage plugin or the find bugs plugin, or all these kind of different kind of plugins for, or the code narc plugin for Grails. And all those plugins are build-related, and Gradle has a Gradle plugin that is equivalent. So it makes no sense to migrate those Grails 2 plugins to Grails 3 because there's an equivalent replacement in the Gradle world. And you'll see that as a theme if you start using Grails 3. The other thing that we did with Grails 3 was we built it on top of Spring Boot. So Grails has always been built on top of Spring. And Grails 2 benefited from that in a number of ways in terms of being able to drop down the layers and tackle more complex problems using Spring APIs as and when necessary, but avoiding any of the usual complexity that sometimes comes with Spring. With Grails 3, though, we decided that we could get a lot of benefit from using Spring Boot as the basis for the framework. So instead of having to maintain our own Tomcat plugin, like we used to do, now the Tomcat container is provided by Spring Boot. Yeah. So whilst in Grails 2 you had a Tomcat plugin, a Jetty plugin, whatever. In Grails 3 those don't exist because they're just provided by the embedded server capability of Spring Boot. In Grails 2 we had things like a standalone plugin which allowed you to package a Grails 2 application into a jar file that was executable. In Grails 3 you don't need that because that's provided by Spring Boot. So Spring Boot provides embedded servers, the capability to create runnable jars, some interesting APIs around microservices and Spring Cloud, which Grails 3 integrates with perfectly. And also we inherited a lot of the configuration model from Spring Boot, so in terms of property sources and so on and so forth. And we have a completely new Grails 3 configuration API based on it. And finally, with Grails 3, the big thing was application profiles. So we want to, Grails is a lot more than just I think most of you will agree, it's a lot more than just a web MVC framework. It's a data access toolkit in GORM. It's a command line code generator. It's a build system. It's a whole bunch of other stuff that is not just applicable to web applications. And not every application nowadays is a traditional servlet environment targeting application. in terms of being request response and having the view on the server and so on and so forth. So we wanted to make sure that Grails 3 could still support our existing user base, who are comfortable working that way and with existing projects, but also look to the future, where folks are now building clients in technologies such as AngularJS or React, backing onto REST APIs, and yeah, I mean, the world has fundamentally changed in that respect, and Grails is adapting to that world through profiles, and Profile is an enabler of that. So Grails 3, just in terms of the feature recap, it was really a foundational release, 3.0.x, and now with 3.1 and 3.2 and 3.3 coming in the future, we are refining it and improving it and making it better. 3.0 was a line in the ground, and now we're building on that. It's a great time to get involved in plugin development in the community. There are improvements coming all the time, and we're working together with some great clients at OCI to help them fulfill their requirements with Grails 3. And so that's been really beneficial as well, to work in collaboration and help guide the framework to fulfill people's actual real-world requirements. So that's Grails 3. Let's talk about Grails 3.1, which is the latest release in the 3.1 line. So in terms of what's new there, it comes with Spring 4.2 and Spring Boot 1.3, so you have the latest underlying components that Grails is built on. That's important because some of the newer Spring projects, like Spring Cloud, require Spring Boot 1.3. So if you want to use Spring Cloud and if you want to use some of those tools, then you'll need Grails 3.1. We made massive improvements to profiles. So in Grails 3.0, the profiles were kind of, the infrastructure was there, but it was quite hard-coded, and there was no way to create your own profile or publish a new one or anything like that. So we've done significant improvements to make the profile mechanism completely extensible. We introduced the REST profile and the AngularJS profile, which I'll be talking about in a minute. And of course, there's GORM 5, which is a very important release in terms of GORM. So let's talk about the profile improvements. So we have, in Grails 3, as I said, the profiles were essentially defined in a Git repository, and that path to that repository was hard-coded. Now, each profile is a jar file, and we have a new set of Gradle plugins to help you build your own profiles. And you can publish a profile to a Maven repository, your own profile, and you can, there's even a profile for creating profile, which I'll explain in a minute, and it's completely extensible. So why are profiles interesting, and what are profiles? So when you run Grails create app, it'll create an application for you, and that application by default is your traditional Grails application that you're familiar with. But now we have a flag that you can pass to the create app command, where you can specify the profile, and you can say, for example, REST API. And instead of creating a traditional Grails application where the view is rendered on the server, it'll create an application that's specifically targeted at building REST web services. So there will not be any UI components or any dependencies in that application. It's a focused environment. It'll also change the code generation commands. So when you do generate views, for example, in a normal Grails application, it's going to generate you some GSP views for rendering the views on the server side. But that command in the REST API profile instead generates JSON views, so that you can render your JSON output. So the whole environment and the code generation tools and everything adapt to the profile that you're currently using. Another use case for profiles as well is if you have an organization, a large company, and that organization has a standard set of Grails plugins that everybody should be using, or a standard set of Gradle build that everybody should be using, you can dictate that to your developers by creating a profile in your organization. So I can create my company profile, and that profile can extend one of Grails' existing profiles, like a REST API profile or anything. You can then publish that profile to your local Nexus repository, and then when all your developers can, you can tell all your developers, when you create a new application, a new project, run create app profile my company, and it will set up your application specifically for your environment, maybe with the correct configuration for your Nexus repository for publishing, the correct configuration already for your CI server, the default set of plugins that you want for your organization. So you can automate that whole process of integrating Grails into your developer workflow within your company. So yeah, profiles, they can contribute to your build, the build.gradle. They can contribute dependencies, build plugins, features, commands, and templates. So dependencies are like additional plugins or different Java files. Build plugins are additional Gradle plugins, essentially. So a profile can say, it must use these set of Gradle plugins. Features are essentially a sub-concept of profiles where you may have a profile, for example, the REST API profile, but you either want that to be backed onto a MongoDB database or a Hibernate database. So you can say create app profile REST API and then say, but I want to use MongoDB instead of Hibernate. So you change the features that compose the profile, if you see what I'm saying. Commands, so the generate commands, or the create app creation commands, and the templates that render those project files into your project structure. Okay, so I'm going to do just a quick demo. There's enough talking about this. Just trying to see if I can make this font bigger, because that's kind of a little bit tiny. One of the cool things in Grails 3.1 is if I create an empty directory, now previously, if I started interactive mode in Grails, in earlier versions of Grails, this wouldn't do anything on an empty directory. It would give you an error or something. But now you can type Grails in this directory, and automatically it loads interactive mode. So this is handy because now if I hit tab, you can see that I've got some commands here to help me set up my application. Yeah. So I'm no longer required to remember all of the create app arguments and different combinations, since they're getting more complicated with the introduction of profiles. But you can see that, for example, there is a list profiles command. If you run that, we can see what the available profiles are. I anticipate this list will grow. We have, with 3.1, we released an Angular profile. But this is a great area if you are looking to contribute to the community, and you really like React. It would be great if the community contributed like a React profile or anything, any new profiles. So a great area for the community to contribute, and we imagine seeing more contributions in this area in the future. So anyway, we can see our different profiles here. We can find out information about a particular profile by using the profile info command. And that will tell you information about the profile, what different commands it provides at the command line, also the available features that you get with this profile. And so the cool thing is now we can just type create app, and I don't need to put the name because the name of the project is the current directory I'm in, that I created. If I hit tab, I can specify which profile that I want to use. So, for example, the REST API profile for creating a REST API. If I hit tab again, I can say which features I want to include in my REST API application. I hit tab again. You can see that I, for example, can say that I want JSON views. I want to use MongoDB as my database, and I want to set up Spring Security REST for authentication. So we hit that. It creates my application, initializes the project structure. Looks like I still have some things to download. But anyway, essentially it will completely configure my project and set it up for the different features that I requested. So I get a new application with Spring Security REST, with JSON views, and with backing onto MongoDB. Luckily, I already have a project set up, so we're not going to have to wait for these dependencies to download. But that's just a general idea of how profiles work and contribute to helping you get productive with Grails. So I don't have enough time with the length of this talk to go into like creation of profiles, and but that is all documented. So it's very much, we have a Gradle plugin that will compile a profile into a jar file that you can publish to your own Nexus repository. As I said, we have a profile to help you create profiles. So you can say create app profile equals profile, and it'll set up commands to help you generate new commands and set everything up, provide you the default. And it's just a matter of configuring things. It's very simple, and it's all documented in the user guide on how to create your own profiles. But as I said, with the length of this talk, I don't want to leave out discussion of the REST profile and some of the other important features of Grails 3.1. So the REST profile, as I said, is targeted at building REST applications. So you get REST-specific commands, plugins and commands. There's no GSP because there's no view on the server, so to speak. There's no asset pipeline or any UI-related plugins. Pure REST application. You can use the AngularJS profile if you are planning on using AngularJS, or you could have your complete JavaScript toolchain separate in a different project and talk to the Grails REST backend. However you prefer to set it up, that's up to you. And the views are rendered by JSON and markup as the two options. So let's get on to a demo of the REST profile. So as I said, fortunately, it actually did finish downloading. So we can. I'm not going to go into that anymore. But I already do have a project here in IntelliJ set up for this eventuality. And this project is I'm going to CD into it in here. I think it's one I created earlier. And this is a Grails 3 application. So we got our usual Grails app directory. We can identify that it's a Grails 3 application quite easily because we have a build.gradle in the roots of the project. And looking at the build.gradle, you can see that I've created this application with the REST API profile, as I said before. And we can see that some of the differences are already apparent. We have a build plugin here called Views Gradle. And we have a plugin applied here that's called a Gradle plugin applied called Views JSON. And down here we also have a dependency on the Views JSON plugin at runtime. So why is this like this? The REST API plugin, as I said, has this notion of JSON views built in, and they are views that live in the views directory, and they end in .json, yeah, and they are used to render your JSON responses. And in order to make those during development time, obviously we render those directly from the source file. But when you create a production deployment of your application, we pre-compile those views into Groovy classes so that you don't leak permgen at runtime in production. So the build.gradle is already set up to compile your JSON views for production. Other things to note, and I'm going to run this application just so that we can see that in action. But if we look in the views directory, we can see that there is no GSP here. There is an error.json, which is the default JSON view that's rendered when an error happens on the server, like an exception or anything like that. And you can see that it sets the response.status to 500 and renders this JSON. So with a message of internal server error and the internal error code. There is a notfound.json, and this is the JSON file that is rendered when a URL is hit that is not found, essentially. So it returns the 404 and returns a JSON response with a not found message, and that's it, pretty simple. Then in the application directory here, we have an index.json. So how is this rendered? So if we look at our controllers directory and we go to our URL mappings, you'll see that in here, the root URL is mapped to a controller called application and an action called index. Yeah? And we can see that there is an application controller which essentially returns a model from the action which contains the Grails application and the Grails plugin manager. Yeah? This is the action here. And if we look at the index.json which gets rendered, this essentially produces JSON from the Grails application's information, so information about the available controllers. So if we come into a suitably useful REST client, like this one, localhost, and we hit port 8080, submit, you can see that we get our response, which is rendered by our index.json file. Yeah? So this JSON was produced by the index.json. So the REST API profile is completely set up to help you produce JSON responses. Now, I'm introducing a concept here, which I wanted to cover more in my I think I'll just cover it now. In that the JSON views are a replacement for GSP in the structure of your application. So the idea of this is we started to see this more and more with the problem with existing marshallers and renderers is that you start to convolute what's essentially view rendering logic into your controller and into your controller layer or in other places in your code base. So if you think about it, JSON is just another view representation of your data. Yeah? So we introduced the notion of JSON views as a replacement for GSP. So your controller can continue to do the sole purpose of what a controller should be doing, which is producing an appropriate model. Yeah? And leaving the rendering of the output of the JSON up to the view layer, which is your JSON view layer. But JSON views are much more interesting than just rendering an index page. So I'm going to do a few more demos here. So I'm going to create a domain. In fact, I'm going to create a domain resource because that'll be fun. Just call it book for the moment. And a domain resource is essentially a domain class that is mapped with the @resource annotation. So what does this do? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a URI in here just because I can avoid setting up the URL mapping. And we can say title and the number of pages. can add your constraints, whatever else. So I've got a domain class in here that's going to be mapped to my database. And what I'm going to do now is generate a set of views for that domain class. Yeah. So remember, I mentioned before that in the default Grails profile, when you run generate views, it generates you a set of GSP files, set of for rendering HTML. If I run generate views with the REST API profile, instead of GSP files, what I get is a book directory in here. There it is. And the book directory contains JSON files that were generated for me. So I have a show.json, which is rendered every time my book instance is shown. And you can see that the JSON file here defines a model, and the model has a single book. And then the JSON output is rendered using a template. We have what's called the template namespace. So a similar concept exists in GSP, the template namespace. I don't know if anybody's used that here. But essentially, this temple variable is the template namespace. And whenever you invoke a method on the temple object, it'll try and render a template of the same name. So it's going to look for a template called book, and it's passing the model into the template. And the template, just like in GSP, templates in JSON start with underscore. So we have underscore book.json, and it's essentially going. And the book.json template is essentially going to render my book instance. And you can see that it uses a method called g.render. And the nice thing about JSON views as well is you get all sorts of code completion within them inside IntelliJ, and they're statically compiled, so they're highly performant for rendering JSON responses. So we can see that there's a bunch of variations on the render method. In this case, I'm just passing in the book. And what will that do? That'll essentially render all the properties of the book object. Now, I could, if I don't want to rely on Grails' default rendering, I can come in here and I can specify a title and number of pages or something like that, and create my own custom format. Or if you want to customize, you'll see that there's different arguments here. So I can pass in the book and then pass in a map that says I only want to includes the title. And you can see that also that the last argument is a closure, and so that allows you to provide additional JSON output. So I can say I want to have the number of pages be like that. Yeah. So you can augment the JSON output. You can include, exclude, complete control of how the JSON is actually output. Another thing that is important to note in this application is that every time a book is rendered, it'll try and render this book.json template. Yeah. So I'm just going to run the application, and then we're going to move on because I don't have too much time remaining. Actually, I probably should have created some test data just so that we can. That book had like 10,000 pages. Anyway, so we run this, and essentially, if we come into our REST client gizmo thing here, and we go to the books endpoint, then we get an internal server. Can I call subject title? Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was the danger. So what I'll do is in the book template, I'll just, yeah, it's supposed to be a look, but I'll just do that for the moment. And then, there we go. So if I go to an individual, so you see it rendered an array of books because I went to the books endpoint, but if I go to books 1, I get just the JSON output, yeah. So there we go. That's the rest. Oh my goodness, what's happened here? Am I zoomed in? Okay. So that's the REST profile. Complete environment targeted at building REST applications, makes you a lot more productive, integrates with things like Spring Security, REST plugin, and fantastic new environment. You got JSON and markup views. I don't have time to cover markup views, but JSON views are the default for producing JSON output, which is the typical way to do things nowadays with REST APIs. I'm sure there's people producing XML as well, but it's not the default. Easy creation of REST APIs, and also there's integrated unit and functional testing. I didn't demonstrate that, but when you can generate functional tests that use a REST client to test your API automatically. So that's all included out of the box. There's also the AngularJS profile. Again, topic of a separate talk, but it extends the REST profile, so it uses the REST profile for the data on the back end. But it adds a AngularJS integration into the project with Asset Pipeline and Gradle plugins to power the rendering of the Angular views. We are also looking at long-term support for Angular 2 and scaffolding. That's coming along the line in terms of the roadmap. The profile itself has AngularJS specific commands like create ng controller, create ng service to help automate the common tasks of creating the structure of your AngularJS application and JavaScript. So some of the ideas we have in the future is Angular specific AST transforms, where when you modify your domain model, it automatically generates your your AngularJS code using AST transforms. Potential support for dynamic and static scaffolding, Angular 2 support, and maybe making some of these new features coming in the future extensibles to support other potential JavaScript frameworks, because knowing the way the JavaScript world works, there's always a flavor of the month coming every 3 months or so. So inevitably that will, it's a good idea to not tie you to one thing. So a brief discussion on GORM 5. GORM 5 is a complete rewrite of GORM, removing every metaprogramming related feature in GORM 5 and replacing it with traits. So it has support for Hibernate 5, also support for Hibernate 4 and 3. We added support for the latest MongoDB 3 driver. And the MongoDB implementation is far more efficient than in GORM 4, because in the previous version, we essentially, MongoDB would produce a document, and then we would convert that document into a GORM entity. In the new version, we use the MongoDB driver's codec API directly, so the stream of JSON data that's coming from MongoDB is converted directly into a GORM entity, thus saving memory and improving performance immensely. So GORM for MongoDB 5, GORM 5 for MongoDB 3 is much faster than in GORM 4. We also have Neo4j 2.3 support, which we developed in collaboration with a real-world client who are using it in production, which is a complete rewrite of GORM for Neo4j. So the Neo4j graph database and Cassandra support. There's a new website as well for GORM, which helps you get up and running whether you're using Grails or not. So if you're using Grails, obviously it's easy to get up and running with GORM, but there are instructions on the website that help you get up and running with with GORM, like in a standalone setup or in a Spring Boot application or in any Rat-Pack application or any number of different contexts, you can use GORM. Ultimately, GORM has now been pretty much completely separated from Grails core. There are two independent projects that are closely linked, obviously, but all of the different GORM implementations are usable outside Grails. So as I said, the Hibernate support completely, it's been completely rewritten based on traits. We support Hibernate 3, 4, and 5, and this was the first time we did a simultaneous release of a plugin for Grails 2, Grails 3, Spring Boot, and standalone usage. Yeah, so the latest version of GORM also supports, GORM for Hibernate also supports Grails 2. GORM 5 for MongoDB rewritten on top of Mongo 3x driver, as I explained before, and Neo4j, it's all based on Cypher. We support the embedded REST and HA modes, and again, it's usable in all different contexts. So here's a little example of GORM 5 for Neo4j and how it integrates nicely with the Cypher query language to make it easier to work with Neo4j in a Grails application. So other things that we tweaked, URL mappings improvements. There's some little tweaks around making them easier to work with. We deprecated proxies in Spring proxies for transactions. Now that we have an AST transform for it, it's completely pointless. So that's been replaced. We removed JSON, not the JSON I was talking about earlier, the Google library that we depended on for some JSON marshalling, and we have completely moved all of our JSON code to use Groovy's libraries. We separated some older plugins like filters, which were still in Grails 3, but were replaced by interceptors. They are now separated out. Well, you can still include filters, but the default is now interceptors. So what's coming in Grails 3.2? We're working on GORM async integrations, so an asynchronous REST client. I've been working on that quite a bit in the last week based on Netty. MongoDB 3 async driver support, so you can have async interaction with GORM, and that'll probably be a parallel API, because GORM's current API is fundamentally blocking, so we have to rethink the way we approach GORM async. Potential lightweight SQL async implementation, and as I said, the Angular improvements we were talking about, and continuing to refine the REST support. Then further down the line in Grails 3.3, we're working on a Netty profile, which will essentially be a lower memory footprint, lighter weight process with a more limited set of, again, a more focused environment. I don't want to say limited, around building RESTful applications backed on top of a completely non-blocking environment, a reactive environment like Netty. We want to make it completely asynchronous, easy to produce REST services, integration with 12-factor concepts, or cloud native is the latest buzzword bingo term is, and integration with the other Grails profiles. And we're also looking to add a multi-tenancy to GORM. In summary then, we have big plans for the future for profiles and the Grails platform. We're continually evolving Grails to tackle new challenges and involving the framework, improving it. We've done I don't know how many releases in the last year, but we've dozens of them, and we have now a build infrastructure where it's much easier to put out new releases, and Slack has really helped us as well to engage the community for feedback. We're iterating constantly on the framework and making it better, and the future is as bright as it's ever been, and we're looking forward to new challenges in the future. And I think our roadmap is pretty compelling, but I'd love to hear your feedback in the Q&A. And of course, the plugin system continues to be a key cornerstone, of Grails and will continue to be going forward in the future. So, thank you. Q&A? I think we have time for questions, no? Yeah. 1 or 2 minutes. Any questions? No?
Do you need coffee?
I must have explained everything like perfectly. That's good.
Does the new JSON views support for versioning? Because
So the question is, does the new JSON view have support for versioning? So yeah, it has native understanding of the accept version header. So you can create a show.json file for your show view, and that'll be the current version. But if you then get, say that's version 1 of your API. If you then decide you want to release version 2 of your API, you create a copy of your show.json view, and you name it show.v1.json. Oh, no, sorry, show_v1.json. The convention is underscore. And you make show.json your current version, your version 2. And then if the client sends an accept version header in the headers, the JSON view has a very intelligent view resolver. I didn't have time to go into it for everything, but it supports different locales and different and a number of different things. But one of the things that it looks for is the accept version header, and it will look for the show_v1.json view if the accept version header is v1, and it will render that view instead. So you can set in your documentation for your REST API, you can say if you want version 1 of the API, send this header, and we'll give you version 1. Otherwise, the current version is, if you don't send it, you'll get the current version.
Okay, thank you. Another question about the JSON views is it's really cool if you can delegate to the render template, the render system, to render all the attributes automatically. But what happens if you have to rename a field in one domain class? You have to, you can't use anymore the render, the automatic render, because this automatically render will use the same the new attribute, and this will break the contract.
So the way you would solve that is to use the render method, but exclude the property that's changed, and then with the closure, which I showed at the end, add the old one back
with the old name.
Yes,
okay, thank you.
That's the solution to that problem.
Mm-hmm.
Just one little detail. Inside the REST profile, there is the asset pipeline feature. I was wondering why you would need that in the basic REST profile.
I don't think it's there in the REST profile. I think it's there in
It's listed in the available features.
Well, it's an available feature because it might be useful if you plan to include like an AngularJS client to your REST backend. But it's not. We have in profiles. You have profiles have features, but they have required features to function, and they have optional features. So the asset pipeline feature is an optional feature. So when you do create app profile REST API, you don't get asset pipeline by default, but you can optionally say you want it. If I don't know, maybe you want to use it for your JavaScript front end, but it's not a required feature for functioning.
The last one.
So you can add a profile or a feature after the creation of after creating the app. So I create the app and I discover a new profile or a new feature in my profile.
Yeah, the profiles are not tied to a Grails version. So profiles themselves are versioned. So when I did create app profile space REST API, it by default takes the current Grails version to look for, but you can put a fully qualified Maven coordinates in that argument. So I could say create app profile space my company colon foo colon 1.0.1, and it will look for the profile using those Maven coordinates, resolve it, and create your application. So the profile, in this case, it was using the defaults, but you can create a profile from fully Maven coordinates at any time.
Okay, thank you.